welcome again to the Journal.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you today. We appreciate the time you're taking for
Sure
us
thing.
today. I want to start with this question, and that is, I've been around a long time. Since we have the privilege of first intimation, I've talked to a lot of people running for president over many years. Your campaign intrigues me perhaps more than many others, and the reason for that is, tell me how and why a mayor of a community roughly the size of Sioux City decides, I want to run for president, and in fact I think I can become president. And then a follow-up to that would be, what do you attribute the rise in the polls you've enjoyed since you made that decision?
Yeah, so it's not lost on me that it's unusual for somebody from a community the size of my community who's a mayor to step up to do this. But that's exactly the point. It's that we're not going to be able to solve the problems we've got right now with the same kind of politics or the same kind of politicians. It would, of course, be more conventional if I were a senator, for example, even if I were the same age. But there are very senior senators in this country who've never in their life managed more than 100 people. What I'm offering is executive experience, a voice from the kinds of communities that my party in particular has struggled to connect with in recent years, a different style and approach on politics, a military background that I think is useful at a time like this, and an insistence that we not only work to defeat this president, but we actually kick off a different era in our politics. And I think that's how we got here, too. Now, I'm mindful that at no other time in the history of the Republic would a campaign like mine be able to do this. But I think the reason we've been able to advance past cabinet secretaries and governors and senators is because this is the message that folks are looking for. And my job, of course, is to continue getting that message out in front of as many people as possible. It's a combination of the kind of experience you do have on the ground solving problems with a mentality that, frankly, at the local level can't afford to get sucked into tribal and ideological politics, connected to an account of where the world's got to go with American leadership that makes it just not like the others.
So you think this is a unique moment in time that has allowed you to get into the race, to ascend?
Of course. I mean, not only is this the only moment in time when we could do this, but it's the only moment in time where I would attempt to do this. It's not like when I ran for mayor of South Bend in 2011. I was thinking, 2 good terms here, and if it goes well, straight to the White House. But we are in very unusual times as a country. And I think any time you run for office, at least any time I've run for office, the process of discernment is to first look at the office and what the office calls for, take stock of that, and then look at what you bring to the table that's different from the others, and take stock of that and see if there's a match. And I've followed that process in deciding to run for office, and I followed that process in deciding to not run for office several times. And as unusual as it is, that process led me to this place. And clearly a striking number of voters so far have agreed.
Doing my due diligence before your visit, I was looking at an interview you did with New Day on CNN last week after the Iowa debate. And you were talking to the host, and you talked about you were cautioning people to not go to the extreme. And I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit, what you meant by that, what specific other candidates in the race, specific issues that are being addressed by candidates in this race. Exactly what do you mean by going to the extreme?
Yeah.
You need to be careful about that.
Well, what I'm offering are big changes. I mean, game-changing reforms in areas like healthcare or college access. But there are some voices in the party who say, that doesn't count. That's small. That's nibbling around the edges unless you go all the way to the cliff. You look at something like college affordability, where I've got a plan that would make college at public colleges tuition-free for most Americans. But there are some voices saying, unless it's free for absolutely everybody, even the child of a billionaire, it doesn't count as a meaningful change. You look at healthcare. The idea of Medicare for all who want it is we take a public plan, quality public plan, and make it available for everybody to participate. But trust people to decide for themselves whether they want to participate. Now, the end result of this is that there's no such thing as an uninsured American. That represents the biggest thing we've done in American healthcare since the arrival of Medicare itself. I consider that to be plenty big, but there are some in the party who would say, no, unless you obliterate private plans altogether at a date to be decided in Washington, that's the only thing that's a big reform. And so I'm hearing these voices saying, you got to go all the way out here or nothing counts. When what I'm also struck by right now is there's actually a powerfully strong American majority to take these big steps forward, even in more conservative areas. So to be at a moment when there's a powerful majority that we could galvanize rather than polarize, I think it's very important not to go all the way to the extreme when the changes I'm talking about are plenty big and will make a bigger difference in our lives than what we've been able to do in these issues in years. I think there's still a temptation for some to measure a policy based on how it moves some ideological needle in Washington. And I'm much more interested in how policy will impact our everyday lives. I think that's a mayor's mentality to begin with. And that's how I approach every one of these issues.
So healthcare obviously is on the list for questions today. If that's not the number one issue, it's close to the number one issue in the country. So maybe you can go into a little more detail on your viewpoint, your perspective on healthcare. The focus is the ACA. Should it be scrapped? Should it be built upon? Should we go to a single payer system? Can we afford a single payer system?
Right.
All of the above. So your approach to that whole issue is what?
So my approach is to create a quality public alternative. That's why I'm calling it Medicare for all who want it. And the idea is we set up that plan. We make sure it's got a high standard and that it's affordable. In fact, premiums would be capped at 8.5% of your income. And we give every American the opportunity to participate. But, crucially, I trust you to decide whether you want it and when you want it. So it puts a little bit of humility in the policy. In other words, I believe it'll be the best plan. And if I'm right in every case, then everybody will want it. They'll switch over, and eventually it becomes the single payer. But if I'm not right, if there are some folks who would rather be on a different kind of plan, allowing them to keep it is obviously the right answer. We're going to be glad we didn't kick them off of it. And doing it in this way also has a much more manageable cost. Now, $1.5 trillion is not a small amount, but that's what it would cost over the next decade, compared to 20, 30, 40, depending who you ask, on some of my competitors' plans. And we can fully pay for it just by making two moves, one of which is to roll back the corporate Trump tax cut, and the other of which is to finally allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. We do those two things. This is fully paid for and then some. Now, in the whole debate over coverage, Medicare for all or ACA or single payer or whatever you're going to do, meanwhile, there's much less attention going into all these other areas of healthcare that are critically important. The loss of rural healthcare providers, especially obstetrics units. Most recently in Marshalltown, but we're seeing it all over the state and all over the country, where you have fewer and fewer birthing centers and you have fewer and fewer medical resources available. That's why we got to true up in reimbursement rates and make sure that they reflect the need to support people who and institutions providing care in rural areas. It's why we've got to make sure we're training a new generation of providers. It's why I believe that loan forgiveness for public service ought to include folks who work in rural areas as medical providers, whether you're working for a public sector or not, because I think that's public service and we need to build that up. We're not hearing nearly enough about the cost side. It's why I've got a plan to deal with surprise billing, deal with prescription drug costs, including a monthly out-of-pocket cap. And I think it's very important that it be monthly. I don't think anybody else is doing this, but I propose a $250 cap on monthly out-of-pocket prescription drug expenses, because most of us don't experience the economy on a yearly basis, but that's how these caps work. So you got folks who are delaying or deferring a medical procedure or deferring filling a prescription so that it happens in a certain month so that they hit their cap with their insurance provider, which is totally out of whack with how we actually experience the economy, because our bills come in on a monthly basis. So we got to fix that. We got to look at mental health and addiction in a whole new way. Part of it's culture. Part of it's a president willing to talk about mental health in a way that makes it as natural and normal to discuss a serious mental illness or an addiction issue as you would any kind of physical medical issue. Confronting addiction, but part of it's also very concrete. Making sure that we have the resources going into building up providers. That, again, we're paying, compensating, and reimbursing at a level that would encourage more people to go into the field. I'm proposing grants. Not all the answers have to come from Washington, but more of the funding should, when it comes to what we're calling healing and belonging grants that would support community-based efforts in order to help support mental health and deal with some of the issues of belonging that I think are leading to the kind of self-medicating that's the beginning of a lot of addiction issues. So we got to deal with that. We got to deal with racial inequity and inequality in health outcomes. There are measurable and serious differences in health outcomes by race, even when you control for income, like the maternal mortality gap. And we've got to take concrete and intentional action on that. So my point is there's so many things that we've got to do when it comes to health. I understand why the coverage debate is getting most of the attention, and of course I think that my proposal is the best. But let's also talk about these other issues around cost, delivery, providers, mental health, addiction, equity, because there are a lot of things that need to happen in order for us to be able to say that we have a good health system in this country.
Two follow-ups on that. One, would then the public option become attached to the current ACA law? Would that still exist? Would that be scrapped?
Yeah, I would think that in the near term, it would sit among options on the exchange. So there can be private options competing on the exchange. It's very important to me to preserve that. First of all, it's kind of personal because that's how I get my health care now that I'm a retired mayor. I get it on the healthcare.gov like everybody else who's relying on the exchanges. And again, part of why I'm designing the policy this way is it's organic. It allows us to see rather than hope that so much in some of the other plans depends on just hoping that Washington correctly guesses the transition period. I'd rather not assume that we're going to know, sitting in Washington, when it's ready to switch things over. Let's allow the American people to vote with their feet. And along the way, we'll discover things that need to be adjusted in the policy design.
And that sort of alludes to the second follow-up, and that is the cost. How is the cost determined or estimated? How do you know how many people will want the public option? And then if, let's say it's very popular, it becomes instituted and it's very popular, and more people shift over, would not then the cost increase? And to the point where you said it's possible we could end up with a single-payer system, can the country afford a single-payer system?
Well, here's what we know. Right now in our current system, we spend less of our dollar on patient care and more of it on administrativia than any other developed country. So we know that we can stand to be more efficient. And as the program grows, and I could refer you to the policy team for more of the guts on how they computed the scoring and all of that, but it's important to remember there will be two different pressures. So one that'll be an upward pressure is the more people participate, the more you're going to have for those who are getting subsidies, the more you're going to have a cost that goes with that. The other side of the coin is the larger the program becomes, the more purchasing power it has, the more economies of scale it has, and most importantly, the more preventive care people are getting, so that the really costly scenarios that happen largely as a consequence of people being uninsured or underinsured and not seeking or getting care until they hit crisis mode is happening less and less. So those two things will have a balancing effect over time. But we budgeted pretty conservatively in getting that $1.5 trillion figure, assuming that the program would be highly popular.
Do you believe the country could afford, if it gets to that point, a single-payer system?
Well, again, a single-payer system ultimately in every other country that has it is cheaper than what we've got on a per-patient basis. So
Yes.
we can't afford the status quo, that's for sure.
And I ask these questions because it leads into the next question I have, and that is, in doing my research, I found Politico created this comprehensive online review of Democratic candidate positions on all the issues. It's a rather exhaustive list of issues. One issue in which no policy positions have been outlined and no candidate has declared a position is on deficit spending and the federal debt.
Well, I don't know how that slipped by Politico, but I talk about it all the time, and I'll tell you why.
I can refer you to the website. It's got everyone's
We'll send it over to
pictures
them
and
then.
names, and it breaks down all of the issues. And that's the one issue I found,
Really?
that they did not have a position on it from a single Democratic candidate.
We'll have to make sure they see what we've put out, because I will say this, it's certainly not been fashionable to talk about debts
No.
in my party,
It's
which is
hard.
ironic because
It's hard.
Republicans are the party of big deficits. Every Republican president in my lifetime has grown the deficit, and every Democratic president in my lifetime has reduced it. So my party ought to get a lot more comfortable owning this issue. Look at it right now. We got $1 trillion deficit under President Trump. And, I think the reason my party hesitates to talk about it is that, we're used to it being invoked as an excuse not to make investments in healthcare infrastructure, other things that are important. But what we're seeing in reality is that there's been very little willingness, certainly in Washington, to get on top of this. Again, I come at this as a mayor, right? I don't get to, we do our budgets in cash. I don't get to print money. If we want to do something, we got to come up with the cash. And I was very proud that we maintained one of the best bond ratings in the state, because if we did take on debt, we did it in a way that was sustainable and manageable, and that was going to reduce, not increase, over time. And you see the difference between what you're forced to do as a mayor and what they get away with in Washington. And as the youngest candidate running, who expects that my generation will be here when some of these financial time bombs go off, I think it's really important we get on top of this. And so that's one reason why across all of my plans, you'll notice two things. First of all, relative to my competitors, I'm being very careful what we promise. It's part of why I think we should make college cost no longer a barrier. That's not the same thing as saying it's free for everybody. It's why I'm careful about what we're proposing on healthcare, to make sure that it's paid for. And again, doing a big thing, but not a $40 trillion adventure. But it's not just the cost side, also on the revenue side. We have made sure that the sum total of all of the things I'm proposing, if you add up all of the costs and all of the revenue, will be ultimately, at worst, budget neutral, and most likely deficit reducing over time. Now, that does mean being willing to raise revenue. Something, again, that most Americans believe we ought to do, including most Republicans, when it comes to the wealthiest paying their fair share, when it comes to doing something about a company like Amazon getting to pay precisely zero in federal income taxes on billions of dollars in profits. When you look at the rollbacks, the way that they can park profits overseas or in places that they don't get taxed, and individuals. We should be willing, and absolutely can do this in a way that's compatible with strong economic growth, to raise enough revenue to fund these things. Yeah.
If I could jump in, a good point. You mentioned your higher education point a couple of times. I guess I'm wondering, and I've heard this from, there's hundreds and hundreds of private colleges in the nation, and your plan would limit the tuition to public schools. So I guess my question is, what would happen to all those private schools? You have a famous, fairly famous one in your own town.
That's right.
And we have two here in Sioux City. They employ a lot of people.
Yeah.
But if there's a pool of students there, and then they also could possibly crowd the public universities with their current capacity, I guess how do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody from South Bend, of course, I'm very attuned to the importance of private colleges and universities. And it's part of why we're not only paying attention to affordability of public college, although I think that's very important. We're also paying attention to making sure we support students, why we got to expand Pell Grants for students at any college to be able to get support on living expenses as well as tuition if they're at a private college, in order to also make sure that we make sure students are more likely to compete. We hear a lot about the concerns of folks with college degrees and a lot of debt. My own household would qualify in that category. But the ones who are most vulnerable are those who have debt but no degree, because completion didn't happen. And then you have the handful of cases where you got debt and a degree that's not very useful because of these predatory colleges, although I think that's a separate category that needs a high level of enforcement. So, of course, when you look at everything from how research funds go out, to making sure that we are supporting not just tuition, but living expenses and other factors for student success. We got to make sure that our overall higher education policy reflects the mixed role of public and private institutions. The other thing, of course, is at the end of the day, most people don't have a college degree. And we can't go around sending this message that the only ticket to prosperity in America is college. If you want to go to college, I'm proposing we make sure cost is never a barrier. But we also got to make sure you can thrive in America whether you went to college or not. And that's why it's so important that we're supporting community colleges, supporting apprenticeships, just supporting people getting paid more. For a community like mine, where 3 out of 4 people don't have a degree.
Okay. Well, getting back to the free tuition part of your plan, I have daughters in college who probably who's going to be graduating this spring. And I guess as a parent, if I had a choice between sending to one college where the tuition was free and another that it wasn't, it would be a pretty easy decision, I think, for a lot of parents. But I also wonder about, like my daughter's case, she's going to leave school with a lot, quite a little debt. How the fairness of that people that have paid their debt versus now they future students won't have that, and you know, the people who are out in the workplace are be paying taxes to retire debt of future students. I guess you can address that as well. But.
Yeah, and again, it's one of the reasons why I think we can take a balanced approach here, and I'm skeptical of the idea that we're just going to push a button and wipe away everybody's debt, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that if we do that, then what if you just paid off your debt before the day of the Jubilee? Or what if you start running up debt afterwards? Because even in a tuition-free environment, you might have to take on debt for the cost of college, especially if you're in a place with a high cost of living and trying to be a full-time student. And so from a fairness perspective, I think, and again, belonging to a household with a lot of student debt, I think it is important that we pay attention to, first of all, the fairness of it going in, but also on the back end, we can create more avenues for debt relief for folks who have it. And a good example is the idea of debt relief in exchange for public service. It's a great idea. It's on the books now. Almost impossible to take advantage of. I think I saw one report where 99% of people trying to apply for it found that it didn't apply to them. Mm-hmm. So making that program more user-friendly and more comprehensive allows for one more way for folks who already have the debt, who entered into it in good faith, but need some way to relieve it, can take a step where they're giving and they're gaining.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Another part of the debt and deficit spending, we've got the revenue part, we've got the spending part. Another part is entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. Those costs are growing, boomers continuing to retire in huge numbers. It'll continue to be an even bigger challenge in the future. Are there any entitlement reform steps that you support that would help address that challenge, which, as I said, will just continue to grow into the future?
Yeah, so what we're seeing right now with the president threatening to cut Social Security and Medicare is, I think, the wrong direction. We've been, I think, fed a story that, for example, Social Security can't survive financially unless we start cutting benefits. Now, it's true that we need to take some steps to shore it up, but it's not true that the only place to look is cutting benefits. If we did one move, raising the cap so that income over $250,000 was contributing to Social Security, you just do that one step, and tweaks that have nothing to do with cutting benefits, then the trust fund is solvent at least into the 2050s, which again I have a selfish interest in achieving because I imagine I'll be drawing on it right around then. Medicare is a little more difficult of a situation, but that's where there are common sense measures like simply allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. That move alone has been scored, I believe, as being in the $300 to $400 billion range in terms of the savings that'll yield over a 10-year period. Other steps that we can take in order to make sure that the system is more efficient and that we're getting better outcomes, not just dealing with crisis situations, but dealing with the wellness of patients overall. It's part of the bigger story of how we manage healthcare costs of the country. And I refuse to accept the idea that America is somehow inferior to all the other developed countries that have figured out a way to stay on top of these costs.
I missed just one quick follow-up.
Sure.
I missed the stat that you gave. So currently there's a cap on income for Social Security at like 130-some thousand.
Yep.
What did you say the amount would be?
Anything over 250, we
up to
resume
250?
collecting. No, over 250.
Okay.
So there's a bit of a donut hole in
So
there.
donut hole
Yeah.
from 130 to
Exactly.
250.
And then over
250.
250.
Okay.
And that does most of the work right there.
Thank you.
The domestic economy, by a number of measuring sticks, it's strong. GDP, jobs, stock market. I'm wondering how you assess the domestic economy today and how your economy, if it's President Buttigieg, would be stronger than President Trump's economy.
Yeah. So the measuring stick I would use, the number one measuring stick, is the income growth of the 90%. If that's the biggest thing we're looking at, then it includes overall growth, it includes jobs. But it doesn't allow you to claim a good economy in a scenario where the economy grows a lot and then almost all of it goes to a handful of people. One statistic I can't get out of my head is the fact that right now the GDP is growing and life expectancy in America is going down at the same time. That shouldn't even be possible for those two things to happen at the same time. And it points to a real problem in an economy where we measure well-being by the Dow Jones. We've got to make sure that more of the benefits of our economy are actually reaching more Americans. You look at minimum wage, it's been cut in real terms. It's down from what it used to be. And today there is not one county in the entire United States where somebody working full-time on a minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. But it's not just minimum wage earners. Even folks in areas where parts of the economic ladder where you've seen wages grow tends not to go as fast as the cost of healthcare, saving for retirement, long-term care, housing, higher education. Those are all growing at such a fast pace that folks can't keep up. And so I'm talking to more and more people, especially in communities like ours, where it's not just that they're having trouble getting ahead, it's that folks find it more and more of a struggle to hold on to what they've got. And that's why I think the central problem in our economy is just that people aren't getting paid enough. Now look, unemployment's important and GDP growth are important. Let's look at how to make sure that's actually working for us. And let's make sure we build an economy where people can thrive as the economy goes through its different cycles, right? The years of Obama-Trump recovery have brought us to this point where we've seen that economic growth. Now let's make sure economic growth is actually getting to us.
So people don't get paid enough money. So you would start with raising the minimum wage, and then other wages above the minimum wage would also grow so that everyone would get paid more? Is that in simple terms, the principle at work here?
Well, I talk about a couple parallel
Because
paths.
the government can't tell the private sector other than a minimum wage.
Well, right now, the government-
You have to pay people this
Yeah,
amount
right.
of money.
Right now, I believe the government is commanding the private sector to keep wages down. For example, right-to-work laws that strip the freedom of employers to come to certain bargaining arrangements with their employees. There's no question that that's had a downward pressure on wages that are in that middle range, above the minimum wage, but below the kind of wealthiest categories. So I would think of it in terms of 2 tracks. One of them is minimum wage, for sure. And that's a big, that's affecting a lot of folks. And we know there are knock-on effects when people at minimum wage have a little more in their pocket because they're the most likely category to turn around and spend that money right away on things that they need. But also for that middle category, we got to make sure that we are empowering workers to be able to get more out of the workplace. And in terms of earnings and in terms of benefits, we got to push back on these incentives to call your workers contractors. I'm especially concerned about the gig economy. You got more and more places where folks find they got to cobble together an income in the gig economy, but it might add up to far more than 40 hours a week of work, but it doesn't add up to a full-time job in terms of your benefits and security. And it's why I'm proposing that we allow gig workers to have labor protections too. It's also why we got to have more of these benefits set up in a way that cuts across the career changes and job changes you're going to go through. Whether we're talking about healthcare and a move that makes that less dependent on your employer, or paid family leave or sick leave, vacation banks, retirement savings. I would create a public option 401k that you can take with you and that your employer contributes into, whether you got 3 employers or 1, and no matter how often you change jobs in your life. Because I think my generation's on track to change careers more often than my parents changed job titles. So we got to look at the structure of the economy to make sure folks can get ahead in terms of their affordability and in terms of their pay and benefits. So yes on minimum wage, but not only minimum wage.
Kind of shifting gears here in an entirely different direction, but what can or what should the American president, whoever the president is, do to improve civility in our daily discourse, in our daily dialogue, and to reduce hate in this country? We just wrote a Sunday editorial just a couple of weeks ago on the subject of hate, and its rise. The numbers are rising, reported crimes, hate crimes against different groups of Americans over the last several years. So I'm wondering, what role do you think the president should play, and what role would you play to address overall discourse and more specifically and importantly perhaps hate in our country today?
Well, the president sets the tone. One of the things you learn as a mayor is that you're a walking symbol of unity in your city. That people who have nothing in common with each other than the fact of living in the same city, look at you and have some reminder of the fact that they belong to the same city. And it's that much more true, I believe, of the president. So we need a president committed to establishing the tone that says that everybody belongs and that builds up this sense of belonging that I think we're crying out for as a country. Of course, there are more concrete, specific things we got to do. I think that I would reverse the defunding of Homeland Security's initiatives on countering violent extremism here at home. I would make sure that we're rigorously enforcing hate crime laws and working to pass them in the states that still lack them right now. So some of this is policy. But a lot of this is what the president says, how the president says it. Frankly, a lot of it's what you don't do as president. When you have a president like this one, who sees very fine people on both sides of a neo-Nazi rally, who welcomes white nationalists in the White House with open arms, I think that Democrats and Republicans alike are largely disgusted by what they see there. And I don't think we realized just how much we were relying on presidents not to do that until we had a president who did. But this is not all new. This is not something that just suddenly came about with the arrival of Donald Trump in office.
No.
We got to look much more deeply at the way that this country is being pulled apart. It's one of the reasons I believe in national service, creating 1 million paid voluntary national service opportunities a year. Because I think about the experiences I had in the military, where I learned to trust my life to people who were radically different from me, racially, politically, regionally. But we learned to trust each other with our lives because we had to, because we had an important job to do. And I want more Americans to have that experience of connecting with fellow Americans without having to go to war in order to get it. And that's why I think we need to create opportunities to work with and be with people from different walks of life. The military has traditionally been one way to do that. Community itself is part of how you do that. That's why I'm a big believer in supporting community efforts to build belonging. Other forms of service, like national service that I'm proposing, can do it. Often faith can lead to this. I mean, we got to decide whether we want a president who would use faith to divide, or whether we can look in it for terms on how to connect people to each other, even while respecting that this is a country that belongs to people of every religion and no religion equally.
Could you describe your faith journey, like, through various, I'm not sure, Christianity, what religion
Yeah.
you are, at what age you were this, what age you were this? and
Yeah, well,
How you, at age 38, where you are now?
like a lot of folks, I guess I'd say it's complicated. So I started out, didn't grow up very religious, but I attended Catholic school and was soaked in a lot of the Catholic teachings around justice that stay with me to this day. But my own faith experience deepened during my time overseas as a student when I was in England, and eventually came to feel very at home in the Anglican and Episcopal tradition.
Okay.
Started attending my own church home now in South Bend, it's a place called St. James, which is right downtown, and very Episcopal church. It's the cathedral for our area, and very intentional about the relationship between faith and community, and about serving the community around us, and have really been moved by a lot of encounters now that I'm in this process with people who are finding that faith moves them to look after others too. And again, I don't seek to impose my experience on anybody, but I do think it's important to be transparent about it.
Of all the Democrats that I've covered this election cycle, I believe in the rallies that I've seen, you bring up your faith every time, not in great detail, which is why I asked the follow-up question. Why do you think Democrats don't speak more typically about that on the campaign trail?
I think we're a little allergic to talking about it because of our sensitivity to how faith has been used to harm or to divide. Certainly as somebody who's obviously very glad for the legal protections of having the equal right to marry, I know a lot about what it's like to be subjected to another person's interpretation of their own religion. But I think we need to overcome our reluctance to talk about these issues because, again, this isn't about imposing anything on anybody. This is about calling to people who are guided by faith and reminding them they have a choice, especially if you're Christian, and the Christian tradition is chock full of talking about supporting the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed and the alien. And we see right now choices that are making it harder for those very folks to get by. The government that is afflicting the afflicted and comforting the comfortable. We should at least be having a robust conversation about the choice in front of people of faith. And I think that's happening with efforts like the Poor People's Campaign. It's nothing new. I mean, the civil rights tradition, of course, came largely out of faith-based mobilization. But I think it's a healthy time for us to talk about this at a moment when we also have a president who's, at the very least, his style, and I would say in many ways his policies, are as offensive to politically conservative Christian traditions as they are to my own.
Can I ask, you mentioned, they're concerned about people that interpret religion for to support their faith or their purpose in a political sense. But it seems you've been maybe guilty of that yourself a few times on the campaign trail, like talking about an issue like abortion, suggesting that maybe you could make a case from the Bible that life begins at first breath. I think you said that in an interview one time. So aren't you kind of in some ways doing the same thing to support your positions in some of these more hot button issues like abortion?
I think there's nothing wrong with sharing how a scriptural tradition might inform our positions. And so when I think about those passages in the Bible, for example, they certainly are important to folks who hold the view that I might on that issue. And other people will point to other scripture that is important to them. But the point right alongside that is nobody should be subject to my interpretation of my religion. And I think that's where Democrats get wrapped around the axle sometimes, or hesitate to even go there, is that I think it is appropriate to be transparent about where I think my faith leads me. It is also imperative to offer an answer on these issues that would make sense to people regardless of their tradition. And actually, even on something as sensitive as abortion, I think it's a good example where, as a country, there's a majority, not everybody by any stretch, but there's a majority who believe in the idea that even if we can't agree on where to draw the line, which may be a deep and spiritual, moral, and by some lights unknowable question, we might be able to agree on who gets to draw the line. And that's where certainly my party comes down.
Can I go back to civility, because it bothers me that people who are not running for office, who are not elected officials, have gone to 11 in terms of their own upset quality with things.
Yeah.
How do we change that? How does that get back in the bottle? Or how do we, because it's just surprising that people will just even call on the phone and they're upset about something, but they're not just upset.
Yeah.
They're upset at 11.
Yeah.
What is that, and why is that? And is it just because the president allowed people to be vocal about their?
Well, I think the president can put gasoline on the fire, but again, we shouldn't pretend the fire is new. And a part of what I'm offering folks, I even say it sometimes in my speeches, is a White House that you could look at and hopefully just feel your blood pressure go down just a little bit instead of through the roof. It's healthy for us to be passionate about what we believe. That's fine. But writing some people out of America itself because we disagree with them, that I think can never be legitimized in our politics. And so a lot of this is making sure that we create enough of a space for us to hash out these issues. And again, as ferocious as local politics can be, it certainly has been in my experience, it usually is in good faith. And we don't see that happening in Washington. It's part of why I think at the end of the day, the answer cannot come from Washington. It's precisely because I know my way around Washington, but I don't work there. It's precisely because of that I think I have something to offer in this moment. Because out there we have reached, I think, a level of bad faith that makes it different than when you're just arguing with a friend about a difference of opinion. And it needs to feel like that. It needs to feel like one of those moments where we hash out a difference of opinion, and then at the end of the hour, we're still friends. Some of it's tone, some of it's policy, some of it's lived experience. And by the way, some of it's also the way people are getting their information. So, I take some heat in my own party for going on Fox News. I do it partly because I can hardly blame somebody for not being very responsive to my message if they've literally never heard it. Which is why we got to penetrate some of these silos that are out there and make sure people also aren't living in their own realities, because then, of course, the realities won't be compatible.
I also have daughters in college, and I'll credit one of them for my next question. She would be upset if I didn't get a question on this end. Because I asked, she's very politically astute and interested in politics, and I asked her to give me a question that most people in your circle and on your campus talk about. What do they talk about the most? What are they most, if they could ask one question, what would the subject be? And she said it's climate change.
Mhm.
So that's a big issue that you've talked about and the other Democrats have talked about. Sort of give us a capsule assessment of your view of that issue, and how does our country protect the planet but not hurt our economy and jobs? And how do we get other countries that are bad actors in this area, like China, to be part of that effort with us?
So this is imperative, and I think it's a hot topic on campuses because the longer you're planning to be here, the more it's going to
Yes.
affect your life. But this is no longer some far off, distant future thing, right? I mean, in my own city, we've had once in a millennium floods twice just during the time I was mayor. And we've seen the increasing frequency and severity of the exact phenomena that science since the 70s has been telling us to expect if we don't get our act together. So when we're talking about the economy, the first thing we should consider is what is the cost of doing nothing. And the cost of doing nothing is in the trillions, not to mention millions of lives that will be lost. The good news is we can create a lot of economic opportunity if we get this right. And so to me, the whole key to all of this is to move it from being one more political battlefield. Because this should be a national mobilization. To get this right will require a mobilization not unlike the moon landing or winning World War II in terms of how we all have to rise to it. If we do that, we estimate it'll create a net number of 3 million new jobs, not to mention preventing all kinds of terrible outcomes. But it has to be something where everybody sees where they fit. So again, coming from South Bend, I think about it in terms of, okay, can an auto worker who lives in my neighborhood see where they fit as we are tooling up for the future? Can a farmer who lives a couple miles from my house see where they fit? And it's one of the reasons I'm constantly talking about things like soil management and cover crops that we should not only be encouraging but funding. I mean, if we can find billions of dollars to take the edge off of the China trade war for soybean farmers, surely we can find ways to invest in supporting farmers who can be undertaking these methods, both proven and new groundbreaking methods for carbon negative farming. That's why my national service program includes a climate corps for young people to work on climate related projects. And by the way, a lot of these green jobs, they're not all exotic, newfangled jobs. Some of them are union building trades jobs, carpenters and glaziers and insulators, electrical workers who are going to be needed just to do the building retrofits we've got to do. So we're coming together as a nation to do this. It not only benefits our economy, it changes the political temperature around this whole thing. So that when we're thinking about climate, we're not paralyzed by guilt or fear. We think about it in terms of pride, that the nation is rising to meet that moment. And that brings us to the other part of your question, which is the global picture. We are less than 1/5 of the global emissions, which means we cannot solve it alone. We're also the world's biggest economy, so it's clear that the world can't solve it without us. And at a moment when American credibility is hanging by a thread around the world, this would be a good time for us to be seen leading on something that most of the people around the world agree is important. And if we integrate that into our relationships around the world, in other words, if there was such a thing as global climate diplomacy and the prestige of a nation depended on it, that's exactly the kind of paradigm shift that would get us back on the front foot dealing with a player like China, who would have to explain on the world stage whether they're going to be part of the solution. Right now, we lack the moral authority to lead that kind of thing because we can't get our act together at home. If we did, it benefits us not just because we'd have better policies here at home, but we'd have better standing abroad.
In my voting lifetime, I participated in every presidential election that I legally could. And twice, the person who received the most votes didn't win the nomination or didn't win the election. What can you do to fix that?
Well, I, at risk of sounding simplistic, think that the person who gets the most votes ought to win. Now, there are two ways to do this. One, there's a compact going around among states that are pledging that if enough states agree, they'll instruct their electoral voters to back the national popular vote winner. That's probably the more realistic way to do it in the short run. I don't think we should be afraid of a debate around a constitutional amendment, though, because every convincing reason for the Electoral College to stand, I think, has fallen away. You know, one of them was if the American people ever elected somebody manifestly unfit for office, the Electoral College would intervene somehow. I think we can take that one off the table. Another one was that it benefits rural areas and small states, but that's actually not true. A small state like Wyoming is too conservative. to figure into the Electoral College. And a small state like Rhode Island is too liberal. A big state like Texas and a big state like California, for opposite reasons, have the same experience. And if you happen to be a farmer or a rancher living in Texas or California, you might as well be a deep blue Democrat living in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or downtown Providence. It makes no sense. And in no other election in the country do we do it this way, right? In Iowa, you do not elect the governor by giving certain counties extra votes. You just count up all the votes and give it to the person who got the most. And by the way, people running for governor of Iowa still show up in rural areas and urban areas. So part of how I'm trying to illustrate the point is to think about how this has really affected us. And I would argue the biggest influence on our lives from the Electoral College is not how many general election campaign rallies were held in a large city in your particular state. It's the effect of soybean farmers living through a trade war that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the Electoral College. Or Iraq war veterans who lived through a shooting war that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the Electoral College, probably. And think about how all the ways our lives have been changed because of this feature that was introduced into our system with, I think, a very different intent. Now, to actually have the reform, you'd probably want to have a delayed reaction so you don't know what party it benefits. I'm fine with that. This is not about, I'll go out and argue why there should be more progressive policies in general. When we're talking about structure for this country, that's not about whether the country moves right or left. It's about how we have a fair democracy. And whether we're talking about how we elect our president or whether we're talking about how we elect our legislators. Iowa has proven that you can, in fact, have fair districts. And when you do, it's better than these indefensible districts drawn where politicians get to pick out their voters rather than the other way around. These reforms are needed because part of what it is to be an American is to believe in some kind of democratic process. And we are, in many respects, getting less, not more democratic. And I think we have a lot of problematic outcomes to show for it.
To play the flip side of, you made a change to a popular vote, that the candidates for president, you mentioned Texas, essentially could just campaign in probably 3 big states, California, Texas, and New York, and win without paying any attention to the rest of the country as far as campaign stops and so forth. Right now, Iowa's a swing state, gets a lot of attention because their 6 electoral votes are important. Even a state like New Hampshire, Nevada, it is. But in a popular vote scenario, they would become, in many cases, immaterial in the outcome of the election. I mean,
Well, again, I think that's disproven by experience. Somebody running for Senate in Iowa does not confine their campaign activities to Des Moines, Sioux City, and the Quad Cities.
well,
Right? They campaign
that's within one state, though.
Right, but it's the same logic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, within one country. Presumably, if you want to be taken seriously in different parts of the country, you got to show up there. And again, the biggest thing that's changed my life about the Electoral College is not how many people running for president came and had a rally in Indiana. It's the fact that our nation went to war because the Electoral College overruled the American people and put in somebody who started the Iraq War. That's how the Electoral College affects us. But when you're running, I mean, by what logic should Rhode Island and Wyoming not count? It's hard to think of a reason in principle that can be defended.
But to Dave's point, I mean, and you would agree that it doesn't cost very much to travel within your own state for governor or for senator, but if you have limited resources in terms of money to spend on a national election, you would focus on the 2 states that have the most clout and you wouldn't visit the rest of them. I mean,
But if in a national popular vote scenario, a Democrat living in the most Republican state in the country would be a vote I'd need to get. And a Republican living in Brooklyn would be a vote you'd need to get. I think it makes more voters more important when you just let everybody's vote count the same as every other American's vote.
Can I ask about
Yeah.
Iowa? Where would you be without Iowa today?
You know, I think one of the really important things and one of the reasons I value Iowa's role in the nominating process is that it cuts the presidential campaign down to size. So somebody like me, not a millionaire or a billionaire or a nationally recognized name, no federal basis for having a giant campaign account when we got into this, would not be here if it weren't for the role of Iowa in the early states. And I think as we see some folks, I guess, reaching the conclusion that you can just buy an election by being on the airwaves everywhere. I think it's a reminder of why it's so important that we have a process. So I have strong feelings about the general election process and the national popular vote. But when it comes to how our parties are putting forward people, this is the stage when people should be able to kick the tires on our campaigns up close and personal. And that's exactly what Iowa does for the process. You have to show your face in a middle school, in a backyard, and that reveals things about you.
Sure.
And I think it's what makes it possible for improbable campaigns like mine to have a shot at the presidency.
I wanted to ask about, how are we doing on time? I wanted to leave some time for the second part of what we want to do, 10 minutes or so at the end. Are we okay for another question?
Let me see where we're at. We got like 15 minutes left.
Okay, great. I want to ask about immigration and the border. Some candidates have talked about an open border. You support, I believe, decriminalizing illegal entry into the country. There's differences of opinion on the border wall, whether we need one, on border security as a whole. Just give us an assessment of the different pieces of that you support. Comprehensive immigration reform, border security,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah, so here's another example of an area where most Americans agree roughly on what to do, and Washington can't make it happen. And the way I see it is we got to break through this idea that you either got to be for kids in cages or you're for open borders. Just to be very clear, crossing the border illegally will still be illegal when I'm president. I do, though, think that we've got to completely overhaul our immigration system. It hasn't been fixed since the 80s. And we know what the fix ought to look like. We know that it would involve a pathway to citizenship for folks who are here. It would involve protections for dreamers, and I would argue they should be at the front of the line for that pathway to citizenship because they're very much American in terms of their experience, but not in terms of their documentation. It would involve a fix to our lawful immigration system, like how my dad got here, which currently has such long backlogs, such tremendous bureaucracy, and so many arbitrary numbers and caps and levels set in stone in the 80s that don't correspond with our economic reality. So when we fix that, what we ought to do is not only remove arbitrary quotas and caps, but allow them to be revised every 2 years based on not having to go back to Congress and get Congress to do something, because we know where that's going to lead. You get to do it once in a generation, but rather have an administrative process that allows work-based visas to correspond to what the economy actually needs. I've been struck, especially traveling through rural Iowa, how many communities understand how much they rely on immigration in order to fuel the population growth and just fill the jobs that are there. But because the economy requires more immigration than the 1986 law can allow to happen, we wind up, the people still come because America needs them, but they are unprotected, and we have all of the problems of undocumented residents living in the country. So in order to fix this, this can't just be about getting a pathway to normal status for folks who are here. This is about making sure for the future that we have a system that makes more sense. And yes, of course, border security can be part of that. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with technology. I mean, a big wall is a very 17th century approach to, I think, the 21st century problem of how migration flows are going to continue to evolve in our time. Plus, we got to look at where the push-pull is coming from, right? So how do we make sure that people are better able to prosper in their own country? Well, we want immigration in order to meet the needs of the United States, professionally and in terms of rural communities needing greater population. But we got a lot of people who are now showing up at our border just because they're fleeing a nightmare. It's not about the American dream. It's about running for their lives, which is why we should be investing more, not less, in the prosperity of places like the Central American Triangle countries. It's not that we can fix everything everywhere. It's that we have an enlightened self-interest in making sure that we're using diplomatic and economic tools to try to lift up the conditions of people living right where they are, so that when folks are immigrating, it's with the hope of the American dream, not because they have no other choice.
I didn't get to any foreign policy questions, but I have one that I want to ask you because you're in the unique position of having served in the military there, and that's Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have a perspective unlike anybody else's from personal experience. So I'm wondering, if you were the president, what would you do about Afghanistan in terms of U.S. military involvement and commitment?
Well, One thing I think just about everybody's prepared to agree on now is that we need to leave. The left, the right here in America, the international community, the Afghans, even the Taliban, are all kind of on the same page about it. The question is, are we going to leave well, or are we going to leave poorly? And what does that look like? Now, what I don't think we can do is stay with this open-ended presence of thousands of ground troops. I thought I was one of the last troops leaving. I thought I was turning out the lights when I left years ago, and we're still there. So it's clear that we cannot accept responsibility for all good outcomes in Afghanistan. We got to be clear-eyed about the difference between our military objectives and our political objectives. Our military objective is relatively narrow. It is to protect America from any threats to American lives that could emanate from Afghanistan. Our other objectives, including preventing backsliding in the development of the country, making sure that the region is more stable, protecting advancements of women, very important objectives, but those can be met in coordination with an international community that shares those objectives. Doesn't necessarily have to be backed by use of force. So if you want to picture what the medium term might look like in Afghanistan, ironically, it's the exact scenario that the president destroyed in northern Syria, which is where you had a tiny handful of very specialized Americans, intelligence and counterintelligence and counterterrorism and special operations folks. Just a tiny number of people who, by being there, were holding the line. They weren't accepting responsibility for the peace and prosperity. They weren't trying to turn Syria into Switzerland. They were there to make sure that the worst outcomes didn't happen. But them being there held the line. That, I think, is what it looks like in the medium term as we wind down our ground troop commitment in Afghanistan.
For my last question, and then we're going to cut, and then we're going to move on to the brief second part of what we want to do today. I'm just going to give you an opportunity to speak to Iowans and tell them why you think you're the best choice in this field to be their nominee.
Well, it's all about the day after Donald Trump leaves office. Not only do I think I'm the best nominee to defeat him, because I come from the industrial Midwest, I can speak to these issues. I served, and I'm not afraid to call him out, and I'm ready to go toe-to-toe with a totally different style and an insistence that we not let him change the subject. But more than that, it's about what comes next. The day after Donald Trump leaves office, we're going to be a divided nation with serious problems on our hands that are only getting worse over the course of this coming year through the impeachment and election and everything else. From climate to gun violence to the economy not working for enough of us, to all of the other challenges we face. And I'm running to be the president who can turn the page, not by recycling the same political warfare, same arguments, often coming from the same people that have dominated Washington for as long as I've been alive, but by bringing a different mentality, a different perspective, and a different experience to that office, to put our lives at the centerpiece of what goes on in Washington. And I'm asking Iowans to be ready to turn the page with me, to respond to this sense of exhaustion and helplessness that I think a lot of us feel whenever we watch the floor of the United States Senate. To recognize that the thing about 2020 is now it's up to us, especially up to Iowa, to set a different course. I'm running to be that president who can help us pick up the pieces, work to unify the nation, so that even when we disagree, we recognize we're part of the same American project, and deliver the solutions that a healthy majority of the American people have been expecting for years. But it's finally time to get Washington to actually do it.
Thank you for your time today, sir.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.